Good morning, at least in Cádiz, Spain. Other countries are evening, early in the morning, etc. Today, we start in Euromarine CU International Marine Science Seminar Series. This is an activity that is parallel to the Euromarine Summer School that will start tomorrow. We have here leading experts in the 8 topics of the Euromarine Summer course, and we thought that should be quite interesting to have these open seminars open to anyone from graduate students to senior researchers. So we first of all, thank you a lot to everyone, because we were really surprised. Almost 200 people has been registered for the conferences from 44 countries around the world. And we have, as I say before, from graduate students to consolidated people, consolidated researchers. We hope that you will enjoy these conferences without any more problems in the next days, and that this will be formative for the people and inspiring. Today, I am seeing here. We start, and we don't have a better lecture than Pippa Moore from the University of Newcastle. Her research is mainly focused on marine climate change and community ecology, and she's a part of a global team of oceanographers, marine ecologists, and she has provided a global definition of marine heat waves and identified the drivers of these marine heat waves and changes in time and projections into the future. As well, she has demonstrated the ecological and socio-economic impacts of these marine heat waves. This is a pleasure and a luxury to have her with us. She would be here in person right now where I am, but she was scheduled to be until the weekend, where she has a small medical problem that impeded her presence here. So luckily, the technology allows us to have her both for those attending in person in the room, but also for the webinar of all the people. Pip, we really appreciate your presence despite this medical question, but we are going to miss you a lot outside of the classroom in those moments of scientific discussion and those of leisure that we could have in the city as beautiful as Cádiz. I hope that in the next future you can visit us and to be with us. So thank you very much, Pippa, for being with us.
Yeah, I'm really sorry that I can't be there today. I went to London and was in a crowded room and got hit by the dreaded COVID. So, you know, I'm not feeling too bad, but a bit tired and achy, and I didn't want to pass it on to other people.
Thank you very much, Pippa. I'm Emma from Euromarine, and before you start your talk, I want to ask the audience who they are, where they are coming from, so that you have an idea of the audience you will have, and also to explain them that to ask questions they can use Slido, but also they can raise their hands if they have questions that they want to discuss with you personally. So, and yeah, I will give you a couple of seconds. And then maybe we can ask the first question. So the first question is, what country are you joining from? So you can see that there are people from a bit from everywhere. Spain, of course, highly represented. but we have people from Hong Kong, Finland, Germany, Portugal, so it's quite international. So yeah, the next question, just to have a very, very brief idea of who you are, is at which stage of your career are you? Are you an early career researcher, student, senior researcher? Okay, so yeah, we have big representation of students and early career researchers, but also senior researchers. So Pippa Moore, for her talk today. Thank you.
So I missed the last part. Are we wanting me to share my slides now? Yeah.
Yeah, if you're ready.
Yeah, cool.
Just to say that the Q&A will be constantly active, and you are also welcome to put your questions in the chat for those that they are online. For the in-person, of course, you can raise your hand. Enjoy.
Yeah, so hi, it's a real pleasure to be speaking to you all today. And as I said earlier, it's a real shame that I couldn't be in Cadiz to give this talk in person to the people that are in the lecture theatre, but it's really good seeing such a large turnout of you. So in this webinar today, I'm going to talk about the ecological and socio-economic impacts of marine heat waves. What you should probably know from the beginning is that I'm an ecologist, not an oceanographer, but a lot of the stuff I'm presenting here is developed from a marine heatwave working group that we established in 2015, and it's still operating today. And the first meeting was in Perth in Australia, and it brought together marine climate change ecologists, oceanographers, and atmospheric scientists from across the world, but predominantly from Europe and Australia. And that first meeting focused on the physical drivers and properties of marine heat waves. We then had a much more ecological meeting based in Plymouth in the UK in the middle of 2015, where we sort of did a meta-analysis of the ecological impacts of marine heat waves. We then had another meeting in 2017 in Onang in Thailand, and later this year in Mallorca, we're meeting up to continue this work. So it's a real collaboration across a wide range of scientists, and I guess I'm representing this group's body of work today. So the concept of heat waves isn't a new thing. You know, we often talk about atmospheric heat waves. In 2003, for instance, there was a very strong atmospheric heat wave in Paris. There was also, in some of the emails last week, it seems that there'd been a bit of an atmospheric heat wave in Spain with temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius. And I went to a sporting event in the northeast of England last year, where temperatures reached 38 degrees and people were collapsing everywhere. And these lead to impacts. You can see people jumping into fountains in cities to cool down. One of my favorite things in the world, red wine. You can see the grapevines here dying, and it also leads to a range of forest fires. And from a human population, it actually can lead to mortality with sort of 2,500 excess deaths recorded during an atmospheric heat wave in 2020 in Europe. But the concept of marine heat waves is perhaps less well known, but we have had marine heat waves for a long period of time. The Mediterranean is particularly susceptible to marine heat waves. There was a big one in 2003. There was a big marine heat wave off Western Australia, and I'll talk about that in more detail in 2011. The Gulf of Maine had a heat wave in 2012. A marine heat wave, or two marine heat waves that got a lot of attention, was the blob, which was experienced off the Pacific coast of North America and Canada between 2014 and 2016. There was also one in the Tasman Sea on the east coast of of Australia and around New Zealand in 2015 to 2016, and then the Blob 2.0 in 2020. So these aren't new things, but one of the things that brought this marine heatwave working group together is that we just sort of hadn't really, they haven't got the same attention as had experienced in, say, atmospheric heat waves, where people experience the discomfort, and it's very visible, the impacts. So I'm just going to briefly focus on the Western Australian marine heatwave of 2011. This resulted in an increase in temperatures up to 5 degrees above baseline temperatures for sort of 6 to 8 weeks, and led to a huge amount of heating from the sort of south coast of Western Australia up to the mid-west coast, was where the most extreme events were held, but approximately 2/3 of Western Australia, the waters off Western Australia, experienced this marine heat wave. And this resulted in quite large impacts. So work by Thomas Wernberg out of the University of Western Australia. He has worked on kelp forests along the West Australian coastline for a very long time, and had lots of pre-marine heat wave data. So prior to the marine heat wave, kelp forest covered about 2,000 square kilometres and covered 800 kilometres of the coastline. By 2013, after the marine heat wave, about 43% of these kelp forests had disappeared, and you can see on the image on the right-hand side is that what we can see is that where you've got these red areas, this is where you've had kelp forest lost, and the blue areas is where it's remaining. And you can see at these sort of northern areas, so remember we're talking about the southern hemisphere here, so at the equatorward limit, there was a much higher impact than further down south along the southern coast, where actually sort of from south of Perth, the capital of Western Australia, down to Cape Leeuwin, is there weren't any kelp forest losses. Now we don't. And what we saw a shift in dominance from sort of a kelp forest dominated environment of this Ecolonia radiata. And what we see is, as a function of this marine heat wave, which you can see in the red lines here, we saw a complete loss of that, and then a rise of this sort of turf species, which is it doesn't have the same three-dimensional complexity, and supports a very different community of organisms. And we've seen similar patterns in this shift from sort of a highly structured three-dimensional habitats to these sort of turf-forming systems, to a range of perturbations, including marine heat waves, but also eutrophication. And what we see is positive feedback loops from this as well, is this turf algae exclude or makes it much harder for this kelp to settle and grow again. So you've got this sort of feedback loop that means that it's very hard for the kelp to return. In response to this Western Australian marine heat wave, they also saw changes in community structure. So what we've got here is we've got a multidimensional scaling plot. And what we've got is the dark blue is the sort of southwest temperate area, the Midwest before the marine heat wave. The red area is the tropical area, and the purple area is the Midwest after the heat wave. So you can see that the Midwest supported algal assemblages that were very similar to the sort of warm temperate part, but after the marine heat wave, the assemblage had sort of drifted to be between the two, so become more tropicalized. So there was a 91% difference in the algal assemblage between before the heat wave and after, and you saw an increase in warm water species and a decrease in the abundance of more cool temperate species. You also saw changes in fish assemblages, not as dramatic as algal assemblages, but again, you see this drift towards a more tropicalized assemblage. And again, you saw increases in sort of tropical species and decreases in more temperate species. And similar patterns were seen for corals, where there's a 6-fold increase and a doubling of diversity in terms of corals, and sort of changes in abundance patterns as you would expect with a warming event. So warm water species increased and cool water species decreased. And so this was a big marine heat wave in Western Australia. And one of the reasons that this working group came together in 2015 is that we wanted to raise the awareness of marine heat waves. And we felt the problem in terms of sort of communication of marine heat waves lay in the fact that we didn't have an overarching definition, and people use different metrics to look at sort of anomalous warm water events. So degree heating days or degree heating weeks are very much used in sort of the coral reef literature. People might look at differences in temperature anomalies, thermal stress anomalies, and things like that. So what we did as a group, we came together and we thought, can we come up with a definition of marine heat waves that allow us to look at the sort of different aspects of a marine heat wave, but also then be able to compare across different heating events. And as I said, this grouping that we brought together included atmospheric scientists as well as oceanographers and ecologists. So we thought that why don't we look at the definitions of atmospheric heat waves and see if that we can either that they're applicable for a marine heat wave, or we could actually make them applicable by changing the definition slightly. So we defined a marine heat wave as a prolonged, discrete, anomalously warm water event, but we then wanted to create some sort of quantitative measures around that. So in the atmospheric world, a prolonged event, a prolonged warm event is greater than 3 days. But we felt because of the sort of inherent latency in sea surface temperatures that actually a marine heat wave should be longer than 3 days. So we define prolonged as greater than or equal to 5 days. We describe discrete as there needed to be less than 3 days between events. So say what we've got here, a heat spike, we would call this because it's less than 5 days, whereas on the right, a heat wave is greater than 5 days. If there was only 2 days between these events, the heat spike would be amalgamated with the heat wave and they would both be a heat wave. But if there was greater than 3 days, they would be deemed separate events. And we defined anomalously warm as greater than 90th percentile of a running average for that time of year based on the long-term data. So we used the satellite record of about 30 years worth of data. There's been some discussion about whether the 90th percentile is the most appropriate figure or whether it should be higher. So in the literature, you'll see some people talking about the 95th percentile, but this is defined as you go along. And as a function of being able to use these metrics, we can look at heat waves in terms of their duration, their intensity, so the degrees of temperature above the sort of average climatology, how frequently they occur, and this allows us to compare across marine heat wave events, and also it can be done retrospectively. So here we've got 3 marine heat waves: the Western Australian 2011 event, the Mediterranean heat wave of 2003, and the North West Atlantic marine heat wave of 2012. And what we can see here is this blue is the long-term climatology. The green is the sort of 90th percentile threshold, and so temperatures above that are defined as a marine heat wave. So we can see for the Western Australia heat wave that at its most intense, it was sort of getting up to 6 degrees above the normal, up to 8 degrees above the normal climatology. If you look at the Mediterranean one, we can see the sort of patterns of duration and intensity, and what we can see is sort of peaks and troughs in the West Atlantic heat wave. We also thought about whether or not we should be thinking about categorizing these heat waves for a range of sort of weather events or climate events or sort of stochastic events. We've got formal naming and categorization of them. So for instance, for hurricanes, we have names as well as categories. For earthquakes, we use the Richter scale. We have some events that are categorized but not named. So we've got atmospheric heat waves where we use a Europe heat wave scale. We've got the Beaufort wind scale, for instance. And so we decided that actually it would be good to categorize heat waves to again allow a sort of comparison and also allow that to be communicated in the media. We're currently, much of Europe and particularly around the UK and Ireland has been in a marine heat wave for the last number of weeks. And at points in time, that has been extreme heat wave conditions, and that received a lot of media attention in the UK over the last sort of week. So we defined marine heat waves. So if they were 2 times above the 90th percentile, they were considered a moderate, and up to 4 times an extreme. So you category 4 marine heat wave. And so that again allows us to go back and look at the different heat waves and the sort of define various things. So we can look at the Mediterranean Sea heat wave of 1999. That's categorized as a moderate heat wave. And we can look at the sort of intensity, so the temperature above the anomaly, the duration, how much of the time it was spent being a moderate or a strong through to an extreme heat wave. So we can see that the West Australian heat wave in many regards lasted for a long time and had a considerable part of that time as an extreme heat wave. So in terms of understanding marine heat waves, it's important to look into the drivers of them. And again, these you can then attribute the different drivers to particular heat waves. So the sort of various sort of oceanographic and atmospheric drivers occur over a range of spatial and temporal scales. So over sort of shorter temporal and spatial scales, you've got sort of local processes occurring. So you've got things like wind stress, air-sea heat fluxes, vertical water movement processes. Across these sort of medium spatial and temporal scales, you've got things like atmospheric blocking of jet stream fronts, oceanic Kelvin cycles, and over larger scales, you've got the sort of anthropogenic climate change and long-term climate change, but also decadal scale oscillations. So at the moment, it looks like there's going to be a big El Nino event, with some people predicting it's going to be greater than 1998. And you can see off, say, the Peruvian coastline at the moment is that for the last number of months, sea surface temperatures have been greater than 6 degrees above long-term averages, and that's driven primarily by El Nino. The current heat wave that we're experiencing in Europe is very much a function of a reduction in the amount of Saharan dust in the atmosphere, and that means that more solar radiation is hitting the Earth. And also blocking winds, which mean that weather patterns have stayed, and so there's less oceanic mixing. So again, we can look at these 3 different heat waves, and we can see that there's a scale of different drivers. So the blue colours are these sort of larger scale, longer temporal scale oscillations, so things like El Nino and the PDO. Then you've got this sort of regional scale in the green, and then these sort of local processes. So what we can see here is that a range of different processes are driven the sort of these 3 different marine heat waves. They're different processes and they occur over a range of spatial and temporal scales. So we're going to get into something that I guess I'm a little bit more comfortable with in terms of looking at the ecological impacts of these marine heat waves. We focused on Western Australia to look at some of those specifics, but now this is more of a global look at the impact. So what we've got is we've got a range of heat waves here. This data we collected using a meta-analytical approach. So these are based on observed impacts of marine heat waves. So this is an experiment. It's just before after comparisons undertaken in the field. And we sort of have ordered these in terms of increasing severity. And what we can see is that in general, this is, don't worry about Hedges G if you're not familiar with it, but in essence, it's a metric allowing you to combine different studies, which may use different metrics for things, and allows you to then combine that data to look at the sort of averaged effects. Anything to the left of the line and where the error bars don't cross the zero suggests that there's a negative impact, and that negative impact is significant. If the 95% confidence intervals cross the bar, it suggests that in this case there's a trending to a negative effect, but it isn't significant. But what we can see is that overall marine heat waves have a negative impact on ecological systems, and we didn't see any real trend in increasing severity having an increased negative effect. We then looked at different sort of taxa. What we can see here, I should say, is the numbers in parenthesis are the numbers of studies. And what we can see is that we can see across the range of different groups is that on the whole, there's generally a negative effect, but that isn't significant across all organisms. So for plankton, macroalgae and seagrasses, there's a sort of trend of a negative effect, but it's not significant. But it's worth remembering, if you remember back to the first slide where I was talking about the algal assemblages in Western Australia, is that you do have winners and losers. So some warm affinity species will do well, where cool affinity species will do less well. And in a meta-analysis approach like this, those are aggregated together. But what we can see is that there's different responses across different taxa. So, for instance, hardly surprising, marine heat waves have a very strong negative impact. We can see the same with sessile invertebrates, but for mobile invertebrates, there looks to generally be a positive effect. And we'll see a little later on as well, is that some of these effects may not be direct, they may be indirect through changes in food. If we look at the different response variables, again, you can see there's a bit of variability, but in general, you can see a negative effect on reproduction, on survival, a negative effect on abundance, coral bleaching, but we can also see that there's a lot of variability in places and not that much of an effect on things like, or generally a neutral effect on primary productivity and growth. We can also look at where in a species range you're most affected. So what we've got here is the sort of, this is the sort of warm edge of a species range, so the equatorial edge versus the colder edge, so the more polar distributions. And what we can see here is the proportion with a negative response to marine heat waves. So you can see that you've got a higher chance, sort of over 80% chance of a negative effect if you're at the warm edge of your distributional range, whereas it's more like a sort of 50 to 60% chance of a negative effect if you're at your cool range. We can also see that when you look at these important three-dimensional habitats, such as corals, seagrass, and kelp, is that you can see that there's we've got marine heat wave days along the x-axis and coral bleaching, in this case, on the y-axis. So with the increase in marine heat wave days, you see an increase in coral bleaching. You see a decrease in seagrass density and a decrease in kelp density as a function of these events. And these ecosystem engineers support high levels of biodiversity, huge amounts of ecosystem services. So you see an impact on these habitat formers, and then in turn you see cascading effects throughout the sort of ecosystem. And this perhaps is an example here. This is of the sort of cascading effects. So this is some data from the blob marine heat wave between 2015 and 2016. So we've got the climatology here, and we can see that these here zoomed in on this area here is these heat waves during this period of time here. And what that led to a change in the plankton, the zooplankton communities. So you saw an increase in mesozooplankton, but a decrease in copepods. Copepods are a really important food source for cod. And so what we saw is during that heat wave, you saw a decrease in cod biomass, and also a sort of decrease, well, not a sort of, a decrease in recruitment. And that also coincided with an increase in the abundance of dead seabirds found on beaches. And there's lots of evidence that the sort of increase in mortality of marine mammals such as sea lions and whales was probably a function of changes at lower trophic levels, at this sort of plankton level, which then cascades up the food chain. And so the impacts that you see to marine mammals and birds isn't a direct effect of the temperature affecting these organisms. They're able to thermoregulate, but it's due to changes in the patterns of food within the system. And these the impacts of marine heat waves don't just affect natural ecosystems. As humans, we're very reliant on marine ecosystems for a range of socio-economic events. So what we can see is that many fisheries have been negatively impacted by marine heat waves. So what you sometimes see is species may shift ranges to new fishing grounds, and this opens up new opportunities for some fishers, but also losses for others. Species may arrive earlier or later, leading to changes in the fishing season. It can create mass die-offs of lobsters and scallops. So, for instance, the marine heat wave off Western Australia led to the closure of the scallop fishery up there for 3 years, which obviously has impacts for the fishers that operate in that system. Sometimes landings may be increased, leading to a reduction in market value. So, for example, the marine heat wave off the northeast coast of America in 2012 led to a real to lobsters moving inshore much more quickly. That led to a real increase in the number of landings, and this led to a reduction in market value, which then also led to an increased conflict between fishers and even countries. So this image here is a bunch of lobster pots stacked up and blocking the road to the processing factory, which is where this arrow is. And this was Canadian fishermen blocking off the route to the processing plant to American fishers, because they were because the lobsters had moved in. And they were having record catches, then taking it to the Canadian processing plant, and it really caused a reduction in prices. So this actually led to a bit of a diplomatic issue between the United States and Canada. Those two countries are fairly friendly countries, but potentially into the future and places where perhaps relations between countries aren't as cordial, is this could lead to conflict. And actually it's a really interesting area of research that's not something I do, but the sort of impacts of warming and marine heat waves on sort of global interactions and the potential for increased hostility between nations. Also, in terms of these socio-economic impacts, particularly fisheries related, I think we need to think much more agilely about how we take advantage of new opportunities, but also then have potentially much faster closures to protect fisheries as well, and also have very dynamic approaches to how we manage our fisheries. And certainly from a UK perspective, that's not something that we're very agile at the moment. So some work done by Katie Smith that I was involved in. She did a review of all the socio and economic impacts of marine heat waves. And this is a very busy infographic, so I won't go through it, but the reference down here if you want to have a look at it. But we categorized all of the ecosystem services using the T classification into provisioning, regulating, habitat, and cultural services, and then looked at what evidence there was in the literature to show these sort of negative effects. Bear in mind, of course, this is only what people have observed, so it could be very, very likely that there were other impacts, but it just wasn't measured. But if we focus in on the sort of Ningaloo marine heat wave of 2011, you can see that we've already discussed the loss of kelp, but there was loss of seagrass. There was coral bleaching up along Ningaloo Reef, which, if I remember rightly, was the first time that the Ningaloo Reef had ever bleached, because actually there's a bit of a cold water northerly current going up there that generally protects Ningaloo Reef from bleaching events in the past. As I said, it led to fishery closures in Shark Bay and also reduced quotas, led to shifts in the recruitment of a whole range of organisms, and led to a sort of tropicalization of fish assemblages. And so this led to changes in assemblage structure. You saw changes in the carbon sequestration potential of, say, seagrass meadows, because you saw reduced diversity. The sort of exploitation of the kelp led to a reduction in the sort of tourism, because there was less diving, changes in recreational fishing, increases in disease, effects on cultural services and for indigenous populations, and changes in assemblage structure. So quite far-reaching impacts that were occurring. So in terms of marine heat waves, I guess one of the things that we want to know is how they're changing. And so work led by Eric Oliver as part of our marine heatwave working group used satellite data, which only goes back 30 years. So we wanted to elongate that data set, because if you only got 30 years worth of data, sort of those sort of decadal scale oscillations such as El Nino have a really strong effect. So we also looked at where they've been daily observation data. So I think there were 6 sites around the world where someone had gone down to the end of the pier from their marine station and taken temperature records for 100 years. And then we used monthly data sets that are interpolated for greater than 100 years to sort of sense check our satellite data. And so what we were able to show that since the 1900s, marine heat waves have increased in frequency and duration. What I should say, we also used a range of models to look at these because of variability in those models, but they all showed an increase in the frequency and duration of marine heat waves. They showed a 54% increase in marine heat wave days per year globally. And work done by others have shown the intensity, frequency, and duration of the 6 most studied marine heat waves increased 20-fold compared to pre-industrial times. And work attribution analysis has shown a clear link with the increase in marine heat waves with anthropogenic climate change. So we wouldn't be seeing the increase in intensity, frequency, and duration of marine heat waves without that underlying sort of fingerprint of anthropogenic climate change driving these patterns. And what others have also shown is that by 2100, we can expect constant heat wave conditions compared to pre-industrial baselines. This is leading to a bit of a debate in the sort of marine heat wave world, particularly amongst oceanographers. If you remember back to our definition, we talk about a marine heat wave being based on a long-term average of 30 years. We suggest that should be a fixed average, and that is what leads to the sort of expected constant heat wave conditions into the future. Some oceanographers say that that's actually not very useful, and we should be using a running average. There was a paper published in Nature last month making that case. We wrote a very short reply because that's all we were allowed to do, and are currently putting together a manuscript explaining our reasons why. And the real reason that we suggest that we should have a fixed baseline is that evidence suggests that species aren't able to adapt quickly enough to actually respond to these marine heat waves, and therefore a fixed baseline is most appropriate if we think that the sort of marine heat wave, the focus of marine heat wave research should be on the sort of ecological and socio-economic impacts on species and ecosystems, and those species and ecosystems aren't adapting as quickly, and therefore a running mean isn't appropriate. It's also been suggested that the return periods of the most intense and well-studied marine heat waves is predicted to decrease under future climate scenarios. So what we've got here is that we've got the 6 large marine heat waves that were experienced So we've got the Northeast Pacific, the blob, the Tasman Sea, the Ningaloo West Australian heat wave, a heat wave in the Indo-Pacific and Australia, the Southern Ocean, the Southwest Atlantic and the North Atlantic. And what we've got here is that we've got temperature increases from 0 through to 3 degrees, and this is the return period. This is the range, and this is the average in the red. And what we can see is that in pre-industrial times, it was sort of hundreds to thousands of years it would take for those heat waves to be experienced again. With a 1.5 degrees warming, you can expect these sort of intense heat waves to occur over decadal to centennial timescales. And with a 3 degree increase in temperature, these marine heat waves will be experienced on annual to decadal timescales. For the vast majority of species, they will have very little time to actually recover from marine heat waves before they're impacted by another one. So the consequences of 3 degrees of warming are quite significant. I've sort of left quite a lot of time for questions, but this is from the Marine Heatwave Tracker website from today. I grabbed this morning. And what we can see is that much of the Northeast Atlantic, around the United Kingdom, around France, and along the Mediterranean coastline is in a marine heat wave at the moment, a moderate to strong heat wave. 2 weeks ago, the coast off where I am in northeast England was in an extreme heat wave, and work done by Alistair Hobday in Tasmania. He's got a predictor tool, suggests that this marine heat wave is going to persist likely through to at least September. At the moment, we're currently looking for some funding to look at what the impacts of this have been. But if this marine heat wave persists in this area for a long time, it's likely to be far-reaching. This is quite unusual. You know, the Mediterranean quite often experiences marine heat waves, but the sort of around the coast of the United Kingdom have been relatively unimpacted by marine heat waves. It's almost been a sort of little oasis of calm. But as you see, this is impacting the system now, with the likely implications for plankton, fish, mammals, and habitats all around our coastline. I'll leave that there, and I guess I'll stop sharing and open it up to questions.
To ask people if they have any questions in the room or online. So far in Slido we have no questions, right, Erini?
We do have 2 of them.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So I will start with the first one. Thank you for the great talk. And would the effects of marine heat waves on ecosystem in general be driven rather by their intensity, duration, or frequency?
Oh, yeah, it's a really good question. We're seeing some studies coming out looking at that. And actually, some species are impacted by the intensity of it because it just exceeds their thermal tolerance limit. I think there was some work came out of the Med maybe last year on fish assemblages, and actually what they showed is in their particular study is that it was actually the rate of warming. So it wasn't so much the actual maximum intensity, but the speed at which that warming occurred. The faster the warming occurred, the greater impact. So you're seeing more and more studies sort of playing with ramp up speeds, the duration of the marine heat waves. The answer is that all of those things probably have an impact. It probably very much depends on the system you're in, how used they are to having that variability. So perhaps in an intertidal system where they experience quite rapid change in temperature, is the rate of increase might not be so much of an issue, but in other systems it might.
Thank you so much. So all intensity, duration, or frequency are important elements to look out for heat waves. And then the next question is more into raising awareness. So how do you plan on showing this data to the media and the public? And what would you emphasize on to raise awareness and push to action in order to limit the climate change?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It was really interesting. So just using the experience of the last few weeks is, I think it was probably 3 weekends ago, there was a lot of activity on Twitter where people were showing that the marine heatwave tracker images that I showed you in the very last slide or NOAA equivalents, and actually using those words like extreme, using the categories, it seemed to get picked up by the media. So on the Monday morning, I opened my emails to find them flooded with media requests, and so did my colleagues as well. So it actually it got quite a lot of media attention in the UK. But I think that the point you're making about how you get this to get us to see reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, it's really difficult to do. I guess the only thing we can do is continue to speak to policymakers when we can to be vocal. I might go on a bit of a rant here, but I remember years and years ago, I did a postdoc at the University of Queensland, and I remember there was quite a bit of debate at that point in time about whether or not scientists should be advocates, or whether we should just report the science and leave it at that. And at that point in time, I think more and more scientists veered on we're just there to provide the evidence. We're not there then to actually advocate for what people should do. And I think that conversation has totally changed now. And I think that as scientists, we balance evidence every day of our lives, and it's part of our job to actually speak out about that, and try and get the changes that required. One of the things that I'm involved in, as well as doing this sort of work, is sort of looking at blue carbon, and particularly the role that kelp plays in blue carbon and potentially sequestering carbon out of the system. And actually, I spend most of my life trying to sense check people who are telling me that kelp's the savior of the world. It's not the savior of the world, and it's really important that we ensure that we speak sort of truth to power or whatever.
Thank you so much for this very detailed answer, and also from your personal example. I jump to the next one that's coming in the chat. How valid is to extrapolate results from Mesocom's experiments on impact of marine heat waves to marine organisms into short to long-term predictions?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen this from ocean acidification research, for instance, where actually the sort of impacts you see in mesocosm studies perhaps are different to what you're seeing in field studies. I think, and then you could say the same about warming studies as well, if you just warm something in a small environment. So I think you have to do those studies. I think they give really important answers on perhaps processes driving some of the patterns observed. But I think that the more reality you can create in a system. So, some of those mesocosm systems that they have at in Bremen, for instance, it's nigh on like you are in the natural system, but you're able to control for a lot of things. So I think mesocosm studies can be very useful, but you've got to be very careful about acknowledging the things that you're not altering. So it's going to be different to all the various processes that are occurring in the natural system that are sort of interacting with each other, be that biotic or abiotic.
And especially seeing how many cascade effects we can have into an ecosystem. So I cannot see another one. I think that would be about it. But if I may, I would have a question for you as a general comment. So I understand that we are able to monitor and predict quite well some, or some of the heat waves that you have been characterizing. I was wondering what's your personal opinion on our observation system at the moment? Are we doing well? Do you think that we need to do better in the future? Just a general comment from your experience.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a biological oceanographer, so my answer comes with a certain level of naivety, but talking to the people that we collaborate with, yeah, we are getting better at predicting marine heat waves, but we would get better at predicting them if we had more sort of Earth system observation, particularly gliders and things like that, collecting oceanographic data. And obviously a lot of the data that's collected using these systems, that they're expensive to run, is a lot around sort of more developed nations, rather than sort of developing nations that might be or are more likely to be even more reliant on their ocean systems, say for the protein they get from fish and things like that. So I guess with all of these things, more is better, but we're getting better at it.
Thank you so much. So for the people in the room, I don't know if you had any hands raised.
Any questions from you? No? Any questions from online? If you want to raise your hand? No? So,
so thank you so much for this great talk.
No worries.
it was really interesting.
So see you tomorrow in the summer school. And again, thank you very much. It's an excellent talk. I enjoy a lot and we have learned a lot. So for people assisting the conference tomorrow, we will be at 11:30, some minutes before, for the talk of Sam Dupont about carbon acidification, ocean acidification. Okay. And we will try to don't have more problems like today. Thank you so much to everyone, especially to you, Pip.
No worries, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Have a nice day.